So today's daf is Lamed Bet, and we're going to start on Lamed Aleph Amud Bet at the two dots where the wide lines begin. Okay? The wide lines begin on the two dots. Ve'im amar le'acher lekabelohi menu areze eruv. So we said that that you can send. Normally, if you send your eruv in the hands of someone who is not competent, either they're not mentally competent or legally competent, then you can't rely on them. However, if somebody else is appointed to receive the eruv from them, and that's the person you're really relying on, is the recipient who's going to take it and complete the job, then you're okay. So the Gemara says, how do you know that, let's say you send a child, and the child is going to bring the eruv to an adult, and the adult is going to place the eruv in the proper location, right? So how do you know that the child, still you have the same problem that you have. If you ask the child to place the eruv in a certain spot, you can't trust him. If you ask the child to give the eruv to a certain person, how can you trust him? So in both cases you have the issue of trust. So the answer is, like Rav Chisda said, the only time you can have a child convey the eruv is if you are watching him. In other words, you can put it in his hand and watch him carry it over to this other person and make sure that you see the handoff, and then you can assume that the adult is going to complete the job. But if you just give it to the child, you don't know that the child is really going to complete the job of handing the eruv to the person who's supposed to receive it. So to here, we're talking about a case where you watched him bring it. So even if you see the child bring the eruv to this other adult, how do you know that the adult is going to take it from him? So like Rav Yechiel said, Hazakah. It is a principle, a presumption. Shaliach oseh shlichuto. Hachanami chazaka shaliach oseh shlichuto. That we have a chazaka, we have a legal presumption that a shaliach, a messenger, will do his shlichut, whatever shlichut he's been asked to do. So therefore, since you spoke to this adult beforehand and asked him to bring the eruv to a certain place, and you sent the child, and you see the child go to him. Okay, so you can assume that the proper thing took place because we rely on the shaliach, and we say chazakah. There's a presumption that a shaliach is going to do what he's asked to do if he agrees to do it. And where were the original context? Because we quoted Rav Chisda as saying ba'omed v'ro'ehu, that when you stand and watch, you can use an invalid messenger if you watch him complete the job. Okay, and Rav Yechiel said that we have a principle, we have a presumption that a shaliach completes his job in general. Where were these statements originally made of Rav Chisda and Rav Yechiel? Because we're using them to solve our case. We're using them to apply to the case of the child. But when were they originally stated? Itmar. I'm sorry. Aha Itmar. Where was it originally stated? Detanya says in the Braita. If you gave something to the elephant and the elephant brought it to the monkey. Very practical case because we know that elephants and monkeys, they work together, in lots of business. So enza eruv, there's not a valid eruv. You can't give it to the elephant to give to the monkey. But if you ask somebody else to take from the elephant or the monkey, okay, in other words, you send the monkey off with the eruv and you ask your friend to get it from the monkey, so then it'll be okay. So the question is, but wait a second. But maybe he's not going to get there. So Amar Rav Chisda says, this is talking about when you watch the monkey walk over to the guy. And maybe he won't take it from him. Again, this is the original context. So the original context was that you're using a monkey as your messenger, and the second messenger is a person that you've already made arrangements with. So as long as you watch the monkey walk over to him, and then you can rely on the fact that your friend is going to take it from the monkey and complete the job, put the eruv where he's supposed to put it. However, if you didn't watch the monkey, you can't rely on the fact that he's going to deliver it to the person, because how can you rely on the monkey?
Why use the monkey or the kid? I mean, if
you can see him from there, why are you doing it? Maybe you're not able to walk.
In advance, have to do this whole thing.
You don't want to expend the calories.
Maybe you don't want to.
It's not for practical purposes. There's some theoretical.
Well, there's obviously from a theoretical standpoint, it's still an issue, but. Let's say, for some reason, obviously you can't bring it. I don't know what the reason is.
Okay.
We don't know what happened.
So it would be an indirect thing for you.
You're a Kohen and he has to walk through a graveyard to get there. I don't know. We could come up with any number of possible scenarios where you would have to do it. You can't walk because your legs are injured. You're watching him on a video camera. I don't know. There could be many possible possible circumstances, but the point is that it works even though you're handing it off. In other words, you don't have to directly hand it to the person and be a part of the process. You can actually have somebody who's an invalid link, who in and of himself is an invalid link. It doesn't invalidate the shlichut that you gave it to a monkey to give to the guy. You might think, only if I directly hand it to the guy can I really consider it shlichut. No, even if you give it to a monkey, it's also good.
You're supervising and you've confirmed.
As long as you're supervising, right?
Confirm the handoff.
Yeah.
Or you confirm.
You have to see that the hand. You have to see that he got to him, and then you can assume that the guy took it from him.
Happened.
Right. So now we get to a general, very, very interesting question. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, that here's an issue, a general issue that now the Gemara is going to deal with for the next, let's say, almost in the next entire daf, is going to be the question of to what extent can I rely on a shaliach? If I tell somebody, please salt this meat, and I come back the next day, can I eat the meat with that, assuming that the person salted it? Like, what can I assume? If you ask somebody, right, so if he's reliable, can you assume he's going to fulfill it? Or maybe since it's not his problem, he's going to get distracted, focus on something else, and forget to do it. So that's the question. So, Bishel Torah, Rav Nachman says, if it's a biblical thing, you cannot rely on the shaliach unless you either see him do it, or he confirms to you that he did it. But just the fact that you tasked him with something, you can't rely on it. And we turn to Lamed Bet Amud Aleph Bishel Sofrim Chazaka Shaliach Oseh Shalichuto. And Rav Nachman says that when it comes to rabbinic law, if you have a shaliach, you can rely on the fact that he did what he was supposed to do. You don't have to check on him and you don't have to confirm with him because it's only d'Rabbanan. But if it's a biblical issue, you have to see it or you have to confirm. For Rav Sheshet Amar, Rav Sheshet says, Rav Sheshet says no. In both cases, if you task somebody with something and they're a responsible person, you can assume they executed their task. So this is a machloket. Amar Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet says, Mina Amina, where did I get the idea that you can rely on a shaliach? Detnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Mishekarava Omer Utar Chadash Miyad Haruchokim Varuchokim Mutarim Mechatzot Hayom Ve'elach. So here we have a situation where when the new grain, any grain that takes root before Pesach, when the Korban Omer is brought, it's called Chadash. It's called new grain. So let's rewind a month. Let's say we're talking about before Pesach. So before Pesach, you have grain that's out in the field that took root over the past few months. So that grain is called Chadash. It's a new grain. It's the new season. You cannot use any of that new grain until the Korban HaOmer is brought. And the Korban HaOmer is brought on the second day of Pesach. So what happens? It's the second day of Pesach and you live in Haifa. You have grain in your backyard. You want to know, can you use it? So can you assume that the Kohanim brought the Korban HaOmer that day? They're supposed to bring the Korban HaOmer, but you didn't see it. There's no Twitter. There's no texting. There's no phone. How can anybody inform you that the Korban HaOmer was offered?
They're not shaliach. They're not your shaliach, though.
Well, wait. So right now they're assuming it's a third party taking care of something for you. So they're looking at it like a shlichut. Okay. So can I rely on the Kohanim to carry out their job? That's the question. And he says, look, it says from midday, from 12 o'clock, even if you live far away, you can assume the Korban HaOmer was brought, and they fulfilled their mitzvah, and therefore you can rely on it, you can eat, even though it's biblically prohibited, even though Chadash, now we know that not eating the new grain from the new year before the Korban HaOmer is brought is a biblical prohibition. And it says that you can rely on the Kohanim, that they brought the Korban HaOmer and you can eat it, even though you're relying on them for a biblical matter. So the answer is, Lav Mishum Chazaka Shaliach Oseh Shalichuto. Don't we assume, doesn't that show you that we assume that a third party is going to fulfill his task? And therefore you're allowed to rely on the fact that the Kohanim brought the Korban HaOmer, permitting all of the existing grain at that time, and therefore you can eat the grain in your yard, even though you didn't see the Kohanim do it. So what is Rav Nachman going to say to that? So Rav Nachman says, "V'Rav Nachman hatam k'dekatane ta'ama." There's a difference over there. That we know that the Bet Din is not going to be lazy. In other words, this is not a personal shaliach.
Right.
This is not your personal that I asked you to do me a favor. Could you please go and separate terumah for me? Could you please go offer a korban for me? No. The Kohanim are under the supervision of the Bet Din. The Bet Din is responsible. It's institutional responsibility. We can rely on the institution of the Bet Din that they're going to fulfill the mitzvah in a timely manner because they know that everybody is relying upon them. We're not, as Rashi says, we can rely on a Bet Din of a shaliach ba'al malo, but we're not going to rely on an individual shaliach. We're not going to rely on an individual messenger. Okay, so now the Gemara says, there's an alternative version of this discussion. Amar Rav Nachman, where Rav Nachman brings this as a proof. Rav Nachman said, in other words, Rav Nachman can not only deflect this, he can use it as a proof. He can say, Rav Sheshet, if you are correct that we can rely on a messenger, so why does the Gemara have to tell us? Why do we have to be told that the reason we can assume the Korban HaOmer was brought is because the Bet Din is not lazy? Just say the reason why we can rely on them is because you can rely on any shaliach. If I can rely on any messenger, it's not a special thing with the Bet Din. So from the fact that we have to be told that there's a special dispensation that you can rely on the Bet Din, that they're not going to be lazy, that means that in other cases I can't rely. That's the implication. That's the implication. So Rav Nachman turns it around on him. He says, not only is this not a proof for you, it's a proof against you. Right? So what does Rav Sheshet say? Rav Sheshet Amar Lach, or Rav Sheshet will say to you, Betin ad palged yoma shaliach kule yoma. You're right. Why do we have to be told that you can rely on the Bet Din to know that you can start eating chadash by midday? By chatzot, because that's what it says. It says the rechokim, the people living very far away, can assume by 12 o'clock it was done. I'm saying that a regular shaliach, you can assume within the day he's going to do it. So if it were a regular case of shaliach, by the end of the day you could certainly assume that he had done it. The chidush here is, you can assume that the Bet Din did it quickly. They did it right away, first thing in the morning, and it's done by chatzot. That's why.
They're precise. Okay,
so that's why Rav Sheshet can deflect this too. Rav Sheshet says, I'll give you another proof. This is in the Braita. It says that if a woman was a zava, that means she had uterine bleeding beyond her normal nida period, or if she was a yoled, that she had a baby. So we know that in both of these cases, not only does the woman have to wait a certain amount of time to become tehora again, but she also has to bring a korban before she's permitted. Let's say she's the wife of a kohen. Before she's permitted to eat a korban, or she doesn't even have to be the wife of a kohen, actually. She could be your wife, anyone's wife, who brought a korban that day, right? And she cannot eat from kodashim. If she's the wife of a kohen, let's say, could she eat, whether she's able to eat terumah or not, might be impacted, but it actually isn't impacted by this. It wouldn't be impacted by this. So the only thing that she can't do is she can't eat korbanot. The tum'ah would prevent her from eating terumah, but she can't eat korbanot until she brings her korban. So let's say you bring a korban of your own that day, and you want to share it with your wife. It's a korban shilamim. You want to share it with your wife. Your wife is a zava, so she finished her clean days. She went to the mikveh and everything. She brings her korban. So what they would do is they would put money in a shofar. The shofar was like a little tzedakah box, right? So they would put the money in there, and it would be like, okay, a zava box, a yoledet box. I said, oh, there's a zava box. Okay, they would bring all of the korbanot for the zavot for that day, and they would bring all of the yoledet korbanot for that day, so that you didn't have to stick around. You dropped your money in the box. The kohanim come, they see how many korbanot have to be brought on behalf of all the people. They have in mind that it's on behalf of whomever, and they fulfill the mitzvah for everybody. So then v'tovelet, she goes to the mikveh again, because after she brings her korban, she has to go to the mikveh again. That was just a midrabanan, an additional thing. And then she can eat the korbanot in the evening. So how can she eat the korbanot in the evening? So isn't that a proof that we rely on the kohanim? Because we left them in charge of bringing the korban. You leave the building and you assume that by the end of the day it's going to be done. So what does that show you? Shows you we're relying on a shaliach.
Still not regular shaliach.
There, it's like Rav Shemaya says, that it's not a proof, because Rav Shemaya said there's a chazakah. What are we relying on? Not on the individual kohen. We're relying on the bet din shel kohanim. In other words, the administration of the Bet HaMikdash, you could say. The administration of the kohanim is not going to leave until all of the money is depleted from those different tzedakah boxes. That's the policy. So you can rely on the institutional policy that it's going to be done. That's different than relying on an individual. Yes?
Why don't we rely on the
Well, I guess the point is that it doesn't mean bureaucrats. It means the group of Kohanim. In other words, relying on an individual, even the most God-fearing individual can mess up. He forgets, he gets distracted, whatever. But when you have a system in place of people, right? Or like they have other cases like this. They're allowed to, let's say, light the fire in the Beit HaMikdash for heating the Kohanim's feet, even though they're lighting it right before Shabbat. Even though normally you're not allowed to light a fireplace right before Shabbat because it might not take, and then you're going to play around with the wood. So they're allowed to do it because it's Kohanim's Rizim Him, because the group, Kohanim as a group, are going to be very careful to make sure that things are done properly. An individual, he might mess up, but you're not working as an individual. So when you're not working as an individual, you have a greater likelihood that you're actually going to fulfill the task, even in a case where an individual might mess up. So the point is that in both of these cases that Rav Sheshet has tried to bring as a proof, Rav Nachman is arguing that these are both cases where you're relying not on the individual's good graces or reliability, but you're actually relying on a system or a group that is in charge of it. So now he brings another proof. Amar Rav Sheshet says, Mina Aminallah, where can I bring you a proof that you can rely on a shaliach to fulfill his task? The Tanya says in a Braita, that if somebody says to his friend, go pick some figs from my fig tree. Okay, so if he eats a little bit off the tree, he snacks off the tree. So then, he doesn't have to take ma'aser or terumah from that, because it's casual and he's taking it right off the tree. If he gets a bunch of them in a basket and he takes them home, so then he has to take ma'aser from it, because the friend didn't take ma'aser, he's taking it off the tree. Right? So in other words, the owner didn't take ma'aser from this produce, the friend is taking it home with him, so he has to take ma'aser from it. But if he said, but if the owner, if the owner said, take this basket and fill it with my figs. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean off the tree. It could mean that, the owner had a bunch of figs that he already picked, but the point is he tells him, if he just tells him, take some of my figs, so he doesn't, if he takes a whole bunch of them home, he has to assume that he's responsible. The taker is responsible for the baser. But if the owner says, take this basket and fill it with figs, so then the assumption is, ochel mehen arai, okay, u'ma'asran dimai. He can eat from them casually, meaning if he doesn't sit down and eat from them as a meal, then he's not required to take ma'aser from them anyway, because the rule is that ma'aser, when you're out in the field, ma'aser is only rabbinically required unless you sit down and have a meal from the food. It's only biblically required once you take the produce home. And this is out in the field, so it's only rabbinically required, so we're more lenient. So what happens here? So if the person is given a basket, and the owner says, take this basket, fill it with figs, take it home. So we can't assume that the owner, that he can assume that there's a possibility that the owner might have actually separated ma'aser for him. Why? Because since the owner knows exactly how much he's going to take, right? He knows exactly how much he's going to take. So we can assume that the owner might have said to himself, hey, I want to give my friend a break, I'm going to pay the taxes on it. It's like if you give somebody a gift but you make them pay the taxes on it, that's not nice. So the friend wants to give a gift and he knows exactly how much his friend is taking, so the owner will take the ma'aser. So that's why it says, ma'asran dimai. When you get home, you separate dimai. You separate out of doubt the ma'aser. Okay, so bamed dvarim amurim ba'am haaretz. This is when it's an am haaretz. Baba chaver ochel ve'eno tzarich la'aser devar rabbi. So it says that's only if the owner was an am haaretz. Why? Because an am haaretz we don't rely on him for ma'asrot in general, right? That's why we have the concept of demai, because we don't know if the am haaretz is going to separate ma'aser. But if the owner was a talmid chacham, and the talmid chacham owner says, "Hey Ari, go into my figs, take this basket full." So you can assume that Talmid Chacham is taking those figs into account and is separating Maaser for those figs as well, so you don't have to separate it when you get home. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer Bamed Dvarim Amorim Ba'am Haaretz Aval Bechaver Eno Ochel Ad She'aser Lefi Shelo Nechshedu Chavrim Litrom Shelo Men HaMokaf. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the exact opposite. He says no, on the contrary, if it's a Talmid Chacham then you have to take Maaser when you get home. Why? Because a Talmid Chacham is not going to take ma'aser for produce that's not right in front of him, because you're not supposed to do that. Min mukaf means that when you take ma'aser, you're supposed to have the produce that you're doing ma'aser on right in front of you all together. You're not supposed to take ma'aser here for something that's in another building. So if he sent you with the basket of fruit and he's a Talmid Chacham, if he's an Am Haaretz, maybe he separated Maaser from it because he doesn't care about the fact that it's not in front of him. But if he's a Talmid Chacham, we assume he fulfilled the mitzvah properly. And since you took the te'enim away, you took the figs away, you have to assume that he didn't take Maaser for them because he wouldn't do the wrong thing. So this is a machloket between Rabbi, which is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Do we assume that Talmid Chacham separated Maaser here? Or do we assume that no, he's davka not going to do it because it's against halakha to do that?
What if you sent Tinok to go eat? Or
to go eat?
To...
I don't know, well, why would he send a Tinok to eat?
Because...
How would that affect it, though? Well, wait a second. So Amar Rabbi says, Nirin divarai mi divrei Abba. I want to tell you that my position makes more sense than the words of Abba. That's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is Abba. Okay? He calls him Abba. Why? Because mutav sheyachashdu chaverim litrom shalom en hamukaf. It's better that we accuse the Talmid Chacham of separating Maaser from produce that's not in front of him. But not accuse the Talmid Chacham of giving tevel to an Am Haaretz, because he's giving this produce to this Am Haaretz, and we should think normally the Talmid Chacham would not separate Truma and Maaser from produce that's not in front of him. But here he wants to prevent this poor Am Haaretz from eating it. Maybe he's not going to do anything, so the Talmid Chacham is going to do it. Because he has to be worried that the Am Haaretz is not going to know to separate Truma and Maaser at all. So the question, the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi or Rabbeinu HaKadosh and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is, what do we presume about the Talmid Chacham? Is he going to be more concerned with the technical halakha of not separating Truma and Maaser from produce that's not in front of him? Or is he going to be more concerned about the eventuality or the possibility that the Am Haaretz might partake of this fruit or this produce without taking Maaser and Truma? What's he going to be more concerned about? Obviously, the latter is more stringent. Eating tevel is isor karet; it's very stringent. But will the Talmid Chacham violate a small halacha in order to prevent the Am Haaretz from violating a big one? But what do you see? Were it not for that concern, what would our presumption be? That the Talmid Chacham separated Teruma and Maaser from the produce, right? If not for the fact that there was some halachic stricture against it, we would assume for sure that he did it. So what does that show you? We can rely on people, right? We can rely on people to do things. We don't have to see it. We rely on the person who did what he was supposed to do.
If they're special people.
Well, let's assume not. Let's just say it's a regular person. He's an ordinary person.
What you just said.
He's a Talmid Chacham, but that doesn't mean that he, so could anybody be a Talmid Chacham. But he's still just a person. Okay, so let's say, we don't usually distinguish between that when it comes to shlichut. So what do you see from this? Aval kulei alma. So what's the point? So here we see that the machloket is whether we suspect the Talmid Chacham or not. Aval kulei alma that everybody is agreeing that were it not for the concern that maybe the Talmid Chacham would have issues with doing this, halachic issues with doing this, we would have assumed he did what he was expected to do, what he was socially expected to do. So you see, we rely on a shaliach. So what's Rav Nachman going to do with this? Rav Nachman's in a corner, he's in a bind. Because here we see that we're assuming in a case of tevel, because when this guy brings the produce home, it's obligated mideoraita, right, in Truma and Maaser. And we're relying that the Talmid Chacham would have separated the Truma and Maaser. We're relying on him. So what is Rav Nachman going to say? Rav Nachman hatam kid Rav Chanina Choza'a. It's like Rav Chanina Choza'a says. The Amar Rav Chanina Choza'a chazako ala chaver she'eno motzi davar she'eno mitukan mitachat yado. It's not because he's a shaliach, my friends. It's because there is a presumption about a chaver. This is a famous statement. She'eno motzi davar she'eno mitukan mitachat yado. That he will not allow something that's not mitukan, that is not properly fixed, literally, to come out from under his hands. In other words, it's an issue of a Talmid Chacham. Not that he's a shaliach for me. It's that a Talmid Chacham will not allow something to leave him that is not fully 100% kasher lemehadrin.
Because he's a special guy.
Because he is a very special guy. In other words, but it's not because he's your shaliach. In other words, it's not because he's saying John is relying on me, Abraham is relying on me. It's because he, because he holds himself to a standard that he's not going to allow anything to leave his premises. It's not kasher lemehadrin. But he's not going to allow it to leave. Yeah, he's not going to let it leave. But that's for we're talking about what will leave his premises. Okay, for other people. He's not going to let something leave that's not kasher lemhadrin. He doesn't want to take responsibility for whatever happens to it. So that's why we're relying on him here. Not because I am going to eat the tevel and therefore I'm relying on him as my shaliach, but because he's not going to allow something to leave him, even if he dies. It says if a Talmid Chacham dies and they find fruit in his house, we assume he already took care of it, because there's no way he's going to leave stuff around that is not mitukan. So they say that, and you'll see also another thing that a lot of times in haskamot of Sfarim, when you have haskamot, the person giving the haskama, he gives the approbation, will say, I didn't get a chance to read the book, but chazakal chaver sheino motzi davar sheino mitukan mitachat yadam. Right? He'll say that's a phrase. He'll say that I know that this guy's a Talmid Chacham, so he wouldn't publish anything that's not good. Right? So that's the same concept. Did you have something you wanted to ask?
Well, I guess you could be truma, things like that, but something here, because we don't have truma. Like, what would be a modern day analog? This is like the VOD selling it's afterwards, like you assume if something,
right, that something's done as quickly as as possible. Right. If it's done institutionally, it makes sense to assume that about a bet din, that they would take care of things fast. Sure. I mean, we do assume things about, like, let's say if you had an individual carrying a letter for you, you wouldn't necessarily know when it was going to reach its destination. But when you go at the post office, you feel like, okay, the post office is going to do it. For the most part. Well, it's not foolproof, but I'm saying,
that's a secular
right.
principle too. It's called the mailbox rule. You assume that if it goes in the mailbox, then it got to the location.
Right. And if it's and in fact, if something, a lot of times they'll use the postage. When was the postage stamped to determine when you sent it? And that's it. You're done. You'll say so it's interesting. We have that in secular law too. Mm-hmm. Okay, Weitzer for John. All right. Okay. So that's how Rav Nachman deals with it. So Amar the master said, so we said, now this is a very interesting problem that the Gemara has with this Braita, because it said that if the owner that allows you to take the fruits, right? He says, take my figs. So if he's a Talmid Chacham, then you don't have to take maaser, because you assume that he wouldn't allow anything to leave without being totally kasher lemhadrin, right? But if he's an Amma Aretz, then you have to, out of doubt, separate an additional maaser, right? So, hi Amma Aretz de kamar le'leman. Who is the Amma Aretz in this case? So if you're talking about that the mitzait. So if you're talking about that the person, in other words, that both characters in the story are Amei Aretz. The owner of the figs is an Amma Aretz. That's why we're not sure if he took Maaser or not. And the recipient is an Amma Aretz. So the Gemara says, you're telling me Ma'asran D'mai mitzait. The whole problem with Amei Aretz is that they don't separate Maaser. Why are you you're telling a halacha to an Amma Aretz about another Amma Aretz? That doesn't make any sense. You're telling one Amma Aretz not to trust the other Amma Aretz. The whole reason why, so Rashi says, La'asrei safek, ha'Amma Aretz chavrei meheman le'tefei minach. The truth is, the Amma Aretz is going to trust his Amma Aretz friend more than he trusts the rabbi that's telling him what to do.
By definition, it's the.
By definition, we're not.
But is it Demai anyway? The whole thing there is. No
right. But the whole concept of Demai is for people who are Chachamim, because if you're an Amma Aretz, well, we're not telling the Amma Aretz to keep the law of Demai. If the Amma Aretz actually kept the law of Demai, we wouldn't have the concept of Demai, because that would mean they were actually keeping Maaser. So obviously this directive is addressed to what we call a chaver, somebody who's part of the scholar of halachically literate, educated people. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a Talmid Chacham up the kazoo. It means that you're a chaver, means you're part of the of that system, that school. So he's not going to listen to you. So obviously we're talking about where the owner was an Amma Aretz. He gives the perot to a chaver, to somebody who's part of the scholarly circle who keeps demai. So and therefore we're telling him, take demai from this. Right? So, but wait a second. Emasefa, what about the end of the Baraita though? Nirin divarai mi divrei Abba, that Rabbeinu HaKadosh said that my words make more sense than Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's words. Mutab sheyachashdu chaverim litrom shelo min hamukaf ve'al yachilu la'amei aretz tivalin. Because I said that it makes more sense to assume that if the owner is a Talmid Chacham, he's going to separate the Maser so as not to cause the Am Haaretz to eat Tevel. So what does that mean? Who is the recipient? An Am Haaretz. So in the first case where we tell the recipient to separate Demai, it can't really be an Am Haaretz, the recipient, because why is he going to listen to us? And in the second case, where the owner is a Talmid Chacham, the recipient has to be an Am Haaretz, because he says the whole reason why we assume that the Talmid Chacham separated is because the guy's an Am Haaretz. So which case is it? The first case and the second case are different cases? That's a little bit unusual. So Amei Haaretz, my Ba'i Hatam. So what are we talking about Am Haaretz here? We're not talking about an Am Haaretz, we're talking about a Talmid Chacham, you said. So the answer is, Ravina says, Amar Ravina Reisha Am Haaretz, She'amar Lechaver, Seifa B'Chaver, She'amar Am Haaretz. The first example, we're talking about two different cases. In the first case, the owner is an Am Haaretz. The recipient is a Chaver. And so therefore we're telling the Talmid Chacham, separate Demai. In the second case, the owner is the Talmid Chacham and the recipient is the Am Haaretz. And therefore we're telling the Am Haaretz, you don't have to separate because you can rely on the Talmid Chacham.
Why bother?
Correct? What?
Why tell anything?
There you go. And that's why it says, Ve'chaver acher shome'o. And there was another Talmid Chacham sitting there. So what's the point? The first guy, let's call him Moshe, he's the owner. Moshe gives to his friend the Am Haaretz Reuven. Reuven, the Am Haaretz, receives the pirot. And so Shimon is a Talmid Chacham. He sees that the Talmid Chacham gave something to the Am Haaretz. The Am Haaretz goes over to Shimon and says, hey, I know you're a Talmid Chacham, I'm Am Haaretz. I want to invite you over for dinner. Come over to my house. So now the Talmid Chacham knows that where did he get this fruit from? He got it from Talmid Chacham, so I could say, okay, now I don't have to worry. Because I know that Talmid Chacham A is not going to give to the Am Haaretz any fruit that wasn't already mitukan. So therefore, when he invites me to have his figs, I'm allowed to go over and eat them, because I can rely on the fact that the first Talmid Chacham did it. But yeah, the Am Haaretz, he's not going to take Maaser anyway. But I, as the third party, in other words, the third party who is concerned with halacha, the chaver, who sees this exchange, what can he assume about the fruit? He can assume that the Talmid Chacham gave the Am Haaretz fruit, that the Talmid Chacham made sure it was kasher the Mahadrin and didn't rely on the Am Haaretz to do it.
And did we set aside the concern about the Talmid Chacham taking Maaser after the stuff had gone?
That's still a concern according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel.
That's probably what's going on.
According to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbeinu HaKadosh, what they're arguing about is which assumption to make. But we're now going with Rabbeinu HaKadosh's assumption that we assume that he would have violated a relatively minor halakha to save the Am Haaretz. But who is this relevant to? It's not relevant to the Am Haaretz himself because he doesn't care about Maaser anyway. It's relevant to the Talmid Chacham who's invited over to the house of the Am Haaretz and happens to know, I know. It's like today you would say, like if you saw that the rabbi gave certain food to this regular ordinary person, and then the ordinary person who's maybe not that religious invites you to eat from it, you know that the rabbi isn't going to give food that's not kosher to the guy, so you can rely that it's kosher. Yes.
So do we also assume that a chaver tithe when giving to another chaver?
The
second chaver is going to tithe.
I would say in that case, it seems like the assumption is, like from what we're saying here, is that no, he's not going to tithe it in that case because he knows the chaver is going to tithe it, and he doesn't want to violate the minor halacha of tithing something that's not in front of him. Right?
Yeah.
So there he wouldn't. He's only doing it to save the Am Haaretz from violating the prohibition because he knows that he's not as careful about it.
So what about the issue of the Talmid Chacham wants to make sure anything that leaves his anything that leaves his domain.
That's what Rabbeinu HaKadosh is saying. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying, yeah, that's true, but not when it involves violating halacha. Right? So Rabbi, now we turn to Amud Bet. Rabbi Savar Oto Chaver Ochel Veno Tzarich La'aser Devadai Isurei Ma'aser. How chaver kama ilave, that Rabbeinu HaKadosh is making the assumption that the original chaver, you're the third party chaver observing this exchange. So what should he assume? So according to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he should assume that the first chaver is not going to want to machshil, he's not going to want to place a stumbling block in front of the Am Haaretz, and therefore he probably did the maaser. Okay? And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying the opposite. You, as the third party who's observing this exchange, should assume the opposite. Since you know it came from a Talmid Chacham, you should assume the Talmid Chacham didn't violate the halacha and therefore did not take maaser. That is the machloket here. Okay, so Va'amar le Rabbi, and Rabbi said back to him, Mutav she'chashdu chavrim litrom shalom min hamukaf v'lo yachilu amei haaretz tibalim. It's better that we accuse the Talmid Chacham. Says Rabbeinu HaKadosh back. He says, better that you accuse the Talmid Chacham of violating a minor halacha himself than of causing a major violation in the Amma Aretz. That's what Rabbeinu HaKadosh says. So, what is the machloket over here? Rabbi Savar nichali lechaver aved hu isura kelila. That according to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, it's better for their chaver to violate a minor prohibition so that the Am Haaretz doesn't violate a big prohibition. For Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Savar, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Nichale lechaver deli avad Am Haaretz isura rabba ve'iu afilu isura kalila lo le'avad. He says that the Talmid Chacham will say, better that Haaretz do a major prohibition and I not do even a minor prohibition. So the question is, what's your spiritual responsibility, basically? And this comes in also in Masekhet Shabbat when we talked about removing challah from the oven. Remember when the person puts the challah in the oven and you want to save him from now and removing challah from an oven on Shabbat in the old way that they used to do it when they would paste the dough to the wall of the oven. So that was a rabbinic prohibition to remove it. So there was a machloket there. Do we say sin, a minor sin, so that your friend will benefit? So here it's the same thing to prevent the Talmid Chacham. To prevent the Am Haaretz from violating a major thing. According to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, better to be concerned with the major violation of the Am Haaretz and not worry about your own minor violation. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, no. The Talmid Chacham says, my job is to be perfect in my observance. So therefore, even if the other guy is going to violate a major thing, that's not my problem. That's his problem. My concern is I don't want to violate even a small violation. That's what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is assuming.
So isn't here Talmud Chacham?
Yeah. So
therefore we can't make any assumptions of Talmud Chacham because even amongst Talmud Chachamim
there's a machloket here. Well, that's what they're saying. They're saying that Rabbeinu HaKadosh is saying, in other words, so that's the end though. I think that's a very good point. That's a very good point because at the end, what is the issue here? In other words, you might have learned the whole sugya and come out and said, oh, they're arguing psychology. Right? They're arguing psychology. What is the Talmid Chacham going to think? Is he going to think, oh, better that I violate a small thing and save the big thing? Or is he going to think, no, I'm so good in my observance, I'm not going to do that. That's what you might think. It's a psychological thing. So that's why the Gemara says, no, it's not a psychological thing. It's a svara thing. According to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the right thing to do is violate the small thing. In other words, we assume that the Talmid Chacham does the right thing. So Rabbeinu, it's a machloket about what is the right thing to do. It's not just a machloket about what is the Talmid Chacham's psychology.
It's a logical thing because,
right.
Because if you're violating, if it's the right thing to do, then you're not even doing that head.
Right, exactly.
So it changes the act.
Right, it changes the act. So
it's like breaking Shabbat. If you break Shabbat
to save a life or something.
You're not breaking Shabbat. It's not like, oh, I'm going to burn in hell so your life is saved. No, you're going to burn in hell if you don't do it.
Right.
Why does the second source not discuss Lifnei Iver as an issue at all?
Lifnei Iver in general is only if the person could not violate the prohibition without you. So here they have the ability to take the maser. You're not forcing them.
But you know they're not going to take it.
You don't know. You don't know because we say Rov Amei Haaretz Masrin. It's possible that he will, but the Talmid Chacham is concerned. Maybe he won't. So it's not really Lifnei Iver because it's in his control. He doesn't have to.
It's an open philosophical question today, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say it is. Yeah, it's definitely. In Kiruv, also in outreach, a lot of times in outreach, they'll take liberties with certain halachot in order to reach out to people and stuff like that. So for sure, there's a practical application of this principle. Rabbeinu HaKadosh is not, but the important thing that you're highlighting here by your question is that it's not so much a question of psychology where you're like, oh, well, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would think that the right thing to do is this. No, it's really a question of what is the right thing to do. Should you violate a small thing to save others from a big thing or not? So now we come to the new Mishnah, Nitano Be'ilan, if you put your Eruv, and again we're talking about the Eruv Techumen, you want to be able to extend your Techum on Shabbat, so you place the food in the location that you want to establish as your location for Shabbat. So you've placed it in an Ilan, Limala Me'asarat Tefachim. You put it in a tree, 10 Tefachim in height. Yeah, there's a picture. We'll look at it in a second. So, en eruvo eruv. This is not a good eruv. Why? Because it's out of it has to be accessible to you on Shabbat. Okay, we're going to see why. It's a problem. If it's under 10 tefachim, eruvo eruv, then it is a good eruv. If you put it into a pit, even if it's 100 amot deep, it's still good. Why is it still good? Because you can go down there and eat it. A tree, maybe you can't climb. Okay, you don't have access. Well, we'll see how the Gemara is going to interpret it. The tree is more of a problem. But going into a pit, you can go in the pit and eat the eruv, so it's no problem.
You have to climb back out.
You have to climb back out, it's okay. Climbing is okay. So the Gemara says, Yativ Rabbi Chia bar Abba Rabbi Asi for Rava bar Natan. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Asi and Rava bar Natan were all sitting. Yativ Rav Nachman Gabayo and Rav Nachman was sitting with them. And they were sitting and saying, Hai Ilan Deka'e Hecha. Where is this tree sitting in the Mishnah? What is the situation here? What's the case? If this tree is situated in a private domain, in other words, it's in an enclosure, so then what does it matter what height you place the eruv, even if it's 100 tefachim high, because a reshut hayachid goes ad la rakia, it goes infinitely up. So if you placed your eruv, let's say this tree is fenced around, so it's no problem. It doesn't matter where it is. It's all considered one location. So that couldn't be it. So then, therefore, we must be talking about a tree that's sitting in the Reshut Harabim, in the public domain. So where did you intend to establish your Shavita? Were you planning on, did you say, I'm putting this Eruv up in the tree, and my Makom Shavita is in the tree? I'm Swiss Family Robinson, okay? I'm living in the tree. This is where I'm placing my Tichum, and that is my place. So then no problem. Okay, so huva eruvo b'makom echad. So you're in the same place as your eruv. In other words, there are two things that have to go on. When you establish the place that you want to be the beginning of your tichum, you have to decide, where is my position going to be? In other words, where is my official residence on Shabbat? Let's say it's right here, and this is the tree. This coffee cup is the tree. You say, this is where I'm going to be, and I'm going to put my food, I'm going to store my food, this is my home, right here. I'm going to store my food right up here on top of the cup. You don't have to put it right in the place where you're going to sit, but really this is where I'm going to be sitting. So you're in two different places, but let's say you said, alright, I'm going to be sitting in the tree, and I'm putting my eruv in the tree. So that's not a problem, you're in the same place. Okay, don't worry about that yet. So then what's the only possibility? That you say, I want to sit below the tree. That's my place on Shabbat. But I'm going to store my food above. I'm going to store my food in the tree. The problem is, how can you use a tree on Shabbat? You're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan. You're not allowed to utilize a tree. So how can you utilize the tree? How can you place things on a tree? You're not allowed to.
Mishtamish be'ilan comes from where?
Mishtamish be'ilan is a rabbinic prohibition. You're not allowed to lean on a tree or use a tree to put things and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a separate derabanan because you might break a branch or something. So we must be talking about a case really where the tree is in a reshut harabim and you plan on sitting below the tree. And it's Rabbi Amar kol davar mishum shevut lo gazru alav ben hashemashot, that anything that is only a rabbinic prohibition doesn't apply in ben hashemashot. Ben hashemashot is between sunset and when the stars come out. At that time is when the eruv actually takes effect. So anything biblically prohibited is prohibited during that time because it's safek yom, safek laila. We're not sure if it's day or night. Once the sun has gone down and the stars haven't come out, we're not sure. So anything biblically prohibited, you're not allowed to do. But rabbinic prohibition, you're allowed to do. And what did you do? You sat beneath the tree. You put your eruv in the tree. You can't use a tree normally on Shabbat, but it's ben hashemashot, it's only a rabbinic prohibition and it's not fully Shabbat yet. So therefore Rabbi says, according to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, you're allowed to violate a derabanan ben hashemashot after sunset, before the stars come out, and therefore at the time when it's really significant, the eruv is accessible to you. You'd be allowed to take that eruv off of the tree, even though you might lean on it in the process. It's no problem. Okay, so Marlo Rav Nachman said to them, Yashar, you're correct. V'chein amar Shmuel. He said Yashar koyach. Right? Yashar, you're right. That's where it comes from. And that's exactly what Shmuel said. Amrullah, they said to him, Patritu b'kulei hai, did you really say this? Why were they asking that? Why are they so surprised that he said that? They said to Rav Nachman, is this the official interpretation that was accepted in the yeshiva? Amar lahu, he said, yes. Itmar nami, it was similarly stated. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, Rav Nachman said that Shmuel said, we're talking about a tree that is 10 tefachim tall and 4 tefachim wide, which means it qualifies as a reshut hayachid and its own place. And you wanted to sit next to the tree on the ground below. And we're following this position of Rabbi Damar, and we're following the opinion of Rabbi who says that anything that's only rabbinic doesn't apply ben hashemashot. So what's the halacha? If you placed your object higher than 10 tefachim, now we understand the Mishnah. If it's higher than 10 tefachim, then what's the story? That's considered that it's in the private domain. You can't take something from the private domain to the public domain, even during ben hashemashot, because that's biblically prohibited. Yeah, you're getting it, all right? If it's below 10 tefachim, it's still within the reach of the reshut harabim. That's not considered public domain anymore. Private domain anymore. At worst, it would be considered karmelit. Right? Rabbinically prohibited. So therefore, during Ben HaShemashot, it's accessible to you if it's under 10 tefachim, because it's not considered to be in the Reshut HaYachid. It's considered to be within the domain of the public domain. Amar Rava said, לא שנואל באילן עומד חוץ לעיבורה של עיר, אבל אילן העומד בתוך עיבורה של עיר, אפילו למעלה מ10, הרי זה עירוב דמטה כמן דמל יד עמיה. That this is only true if the tree is outside of the surrounding area of the city. Because you had the city. And then the 70 amot around the perimeter of a city was called ibura shel ir, the protrusion from the city. It's considered like an extension from the city. And even though it's not enclosed, so biblically it's considered to be a reshut harabim. It's considered to be a public domain. But from the perspective of Techum, you're not considered to be out of the Techum. You're not considered to be out of the city limit until you pass that 70 Amah perimeter. So if this tree is within the 70 Amot of the city, even though biblically speaking it's in a Reshut HaRabim, from the Techum perspective it's still part of the city, and anything on any height of that tree is considered accessible to you, even though in reality you would not be able to take it. Because you're sitting in a public domain, it's on top of the tree in a private domain. But since everything within the perimeter of the city is considered part of the city, you're all considered to be in one place. Okay, from the perspective of Techum. If that's true, then wait a second. Then chutz ibura shel ir nami kevan damar Rava noten eruvo yesh lo arba amot havia la reshut hayachid v'reshut hayachid ola derkia. If that's true, that we're looking at this not only from the perspective of what's a private and what's a public domain biblically in terms of enclosures, but we're looking at it even in terms of techum, and we're saying that anything that's within the ibura shel ir, that's within the outskirts of the city, even though it's not enclosed, we're still going to call that part of the city, and we're still going to call hu ve'eruvo b'makom echad, that you and your eruv are in the same place, even though technically, according to Hilchot Shabbat, you could not retrieve it from the tree. Okay, so then we should also say something else. That Rava said that if a person is sitting in a place in a Reshut HaRabim, he has a square of 4 amot around him that's considered his Reshut HaYachid. So even though it's not enclosed, so if that's true, a Reshut HaYachid we know extends lemala, it extends infinitely. So if he placed his eruv in the tree above, and it's right above him, even if it's 20 feet above him, it shouldn't matter. It's with him in the same place. Now, from the perspective of carrying, you wouldn't be able to retrieve it. Again, because it's in a Reshut HaYachid actually, and you're in a Reshut HaRabim actually. But from the perspective of Techum, you are considered to be in the same place.
Why wouldn't it work for transfer?
Because it's only a Techum idea. It doesn't redefine the place actually as a private domain. Only from the Techum perspective. So if we're working with the Techum perspective, says the Gemara, then even if you're just sitting there and it's above you, high up in the tree, it should be good. So what does he answer? He says, Amar Rav Yitzchak B'rei Rav Misharshia. Rav Yitzchak, the son of Rav Misharshia, says, you're right. It would be true. But we're talking about a tree that the branch extends outside of your 4 amot. So you're sitting right under the tree. That's your 4 amot. But the branch that you placed your eruv extends outside of that 4 amot. It's not directly over you. And that's why it's going to depend whether it's considered to be in a private or public domain or not. Okay? V'nitkaven, as we go to Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, v'nitkaven lishpat b'ikaron, you decided to make your makom shevita, your place of rest, is under the tree. Omai lemala, omai lemata. And what are we talking about when we say lemala and lemata, whether it's lemala or lemata, whether the eruv is above or below? Why doesn't it use the term gavoa v'namuch? Rashi says it should really say if it's very high or it's very low on the tree. Why does it say lemala or lemata, above or below? Above or below implies that you're talking about the same thing. Gavoa v'namuch implies that either you placed it on a high branch or a low branch. So why does it say high or low? Dehadar zakif. Okay? So what it means is that there's one large branch of this tree that curves upward. So if you placed it on a lower part of the branch that's within 10 tefachim of the ground, it's still considered within the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim, no problem. But if you placed it on a part of the branch where it curves up and it's above 10 tefachim, then you wouldn't be allowed to take it down because it's in a Reshut Yachid. And since it's outside of your 4 amot that you're given in the place that you decided to sit as your official makom shevita, it's not in the same place as you are. Because your makom shevita is right under the tree, and it is on a branch that's far out of your 4 amot and is too high. It's in a Reshut Yachid technically, and not in the Reshut HaRabim at all. So you wouldn't be able to access it. So the Gemara says, but isn't it true that you could theoretically bring it derech alav, which means you could bring it high up. You're allowed to bring it above the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim, to raise it up. In other words, it's sitting on what's considered a Reshut HaYachid. You could lift it up outside of the airspace, over the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim, and then down. Okay, so why can't you do that? So it never, right, so it comes from a makom petur, it comes from an exempt area because it went over the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim when it came down. So it should be out of the airspace. The problem is that kishirabim mechatfim alav ukedu'ula da'amar ula amud tisha b'reshut harabim v'rabim mechatfin alav v'zarchuzah v'nachal gabav chayav. That since this branch, in other words, is something that everybody uses, is within the space where people can lean on it and use it in the Reshut HaRabim, it's considered to be part of the Reshut HaRabim. Just like Ula said that if there is an amud, if there is a pillar in the Reshut HaRabim that is the height that people who walk through the Reshut HaRabim will use it to lean on or lean their bags on, it's considered part of the Reshut HaRabim. So too, this part of the tree, we can't say that it's outside the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim because actually it's very much a part of the Reshut HaRabim because it's a place where people would rest in the Reshut HaRabim. So basically the point is that there's no way to get from this tree, if it's above 10 tefachim, there's not going to be any way that you can get from the Reshut HaRabim to your, from the tree, which is the Reshut HaYachid, to your Reshut HaRabim, because of the way that it's laid out. Now we'll take a look at there is a picture of this in the back. I'll tell you what number picture it is, so that you could see what it looks like. Here we go. We haven't had any pictures in a while. Here we have the eruv, either it is over 10 tefachim or below 10 tefachim. So you can see it here. And this is the last one. The last one is where you see it's too high. It's the same branch, but it curves around. This is Tzior number 163. So it says, why can't he bring it this way? Why can't he bring it from the Reshut HaYachid here, right? While he's still above the Reshut HaRabim, and then jump down to the Reshut HaRabim. Why can't he do that? The answer is because even this part where he's standing in the tree, to retrieve it is considered part of the Reshut HaRabim, because it's something that the people in the Reshut HaRabim would lean on. So even if he takes from the loaf of bread here that's in the higher spot, and he brings it to the lower branch where he's standing, it would still be considered to be bringing it from a private to a public domain direct.